I said in front. Of her I will be a billionaire. Then she laughed. At me now, she is working for me. The sound of laughter can be harmless, or it can change a man's life forever. That day it was a weapon, and it was aimed at him. Marcus stood in front of the class, clutching the edge of his presentation board with trembling fingers. The air inside that crowded business lecture hall was hot, thick and heavy with judgment. He had spent weeks preparing, piecing together his dream with borrowed ideas and sleepless nights. His clothes were old, his shoes worn, and his voice unsure, but his dream was real. He spoke of a future where he would build an app to connect small African businesses to global investors. He talked about empowerment, about freedom, about breaking the chain of poverty. But when he finished, silence filled the room, followed by the sound that would echo in his head for years, a soft, cruel laugh. Sitting in the front row was Vanessa, beautiful, confident, and everything Marcus was not. She was the type who carried herself like she was, already living the future he only dreamed of. When she laughed, others joined in, even the professor hiding a smirk. Marcus tried to keep his face steady, but inside something cracked. He wasn't angry yet, just hurt deeply. He walked back to his seat, trying to pretend it didn't matter, but every whisper behind him sounded like mockery. After class, Vanessa walked past him, eyes sharp and amused, as if she couldn't believe his foolishness. She called him a wannabe billionaire, not to insult him, but to entertain her friends. Yet that word stuck to him like fire, wannabe. That night, Marcus walked home to his tiny apartment, shared with 2 other broke students. The rent was late again. The fridge was empty except for half a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. The city outside was alive with lights, people chasing dreams, people winning. But Marcus sat in the dark, staring at the blinking cursor on his cracked laptop screen. He thought about quitting school, thought about how easy it would be to give up, get a job and forget this foolish dream. He could hear her laughter still, not just Vanessa's, but everyone's. But in that same moment, something else began to grow inside him. It wasn't anger. Not yet, it was resolve. A quiet storm. He wrote one sentence on his screen. They laughed today, but I'll build something they'll never forget. The next day, he dropped out of college. Everyone thought he had failed, the broke boy who couldn't handle it. His professors shook their heads. His friends drifted away. Even his mother cried over the phone, begging him to finish. But Marcus knew that the classroom wasn't where his few lessons would come from the streets, from rejection, from hunger, from life itself. The next few years were cruel. He worked odd jobs, cleaning offices, driving delivery vans, fixing old computers. Every coin he earned went into his dream. He taught himself coding by watching YouTube videos on borrowed Wi-Fi. He built his first app in a tiny internet cafe that smelled of sweat and coffee. It failed. The second one failed too. And the third one nearly ruined him. There were nights he slept in his car, mornings he showered in public restrooms, and afternoons he stared at himself in cracked mirrors, wondering if Vanessa was right all along. But every time doubt whispered, he remembered that laughter. The one that told him he would never be anything. And it fueled him more than any success story ever could. One evening, after years of trial and silence, something changed. His fourth app, one designed to help small African farmers sell directly to restaurants, started gaining attention. First a few downloads, then hundreds, then thousands. Investors began to call. His inbox filled. Marcus barely slept. He worked day and night, driven not by revenge, but by a hunger to prove that he wasn't crazy for believing in himself. He wasn't just building an app anymore. He was building redemption. By the 5th year, Marcus had a small office, a growing team, and a business worth millions. He moved his mother into a better home. He donated to schools. And yet, deep down, he still remembered that laugh, faint but unforgotten. People began to call him the dropout who beat the odds. Interviews, magazine covers, podcasts, everyone wanted his story. But Marcus rarely smiled. He had success, yes. But part of him was still chasing something invisible. It wasn't until 10 years later that fate decided the story wasn't finished. One Monday morning, Marcus walked into his new corporate headquarters, a shining glass building in downtown Atlanta. The air smelled of new paint and ambition. His team was growing fast. And today he was meeting new staff assigned to his executive office. He barely noticed the list of new hires. But when the HR manager opened the door and introduced his new executive assistant, the world seemed to freeze. There she was, Vanessa, the same woman who had laughed at him a decade ago. Only now, her eyes didn't sparkle with arrogance. They held confusion and shame. Time had humbled her. Her career had stumbled, her life had not gone as planned, and she needed this job desperately. She didn't recognize him at first, not immediately, but when she did, the color drained from her face. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. In that moment, Marcus realized something profound. Success wasn't the money, the buildings, or the fame. It was standing there, watching the person who once laughed at his dreams now depend on the reality he built. He had every reason to fire her, to make her feel small. But instead, he looked at her and simply nodded, because he wasn't that broke, bitter boy anymore. He was the man she never believed he'd become, and that was enough. As Vanessa turned to leave the office for her first assignment, Marcus watched her go, the sound of heels fading down the hallway, echoing like memories. For the first time in years, he smiled. Not out of pride, but peace. Because sometimes the best revenge is forgiveness. But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. There are moments in life that come full circle, not because fate plans revenge, but because time has a strange sense of justice. For Vanessa, this was one of those moments. When she walked into Marcus's office that morning, she didn't expect her past to stand there in a tailored suit, with confidence pouring off him like light off glass. She had applied for the job in desperation, not hope. Her old career in marketing had crashed. After a failed startup and a few bad choices, she had spent months searching, scrolling through listings, sending applications that went unanswered, until she found one. Executive assistant to CEO, Bright Path Technologies. She didn't even know the company was his, and now here she was, standing before the man she once mocked, realizing that the laughter that once made her feel powerful had become her curse. Marcus looked at her briefly, the faintest trace of recognition flickering in his eyes. He didn't react the way she expected. No anger, no smirk, no words of revenge. Just calm authority. It was worse than shouting, because silence, when it comes from power, carries more weight than words ever could. As she left his office that morning, Vanessa's hands trembled. Her mind flooded with old memories. The day she laughed at him, the jokes she made, the pride she wore like armor. She remembered thinking he was foolish, too poor, too unrealistic to make it. She had believed success belonged only to people like her, educated, connected, confident, but time had stripped all that away. After graduation, she had joined a big firm, surrounded by luxury and promises. But when the company folded under scandal, her career went with it. The friends who once cheered her on vanished. The man she thought she would marry left when her money dried up. Now she was working for the boy she once called a dreamer. Every day in that office was a lesson in humility. Marcus treated her with professionalism, distant but respectful. He didn't bring up the past, didn't look at her with pity or anger. And somehow that made it harder, because kindness from someone you once hurt can feel like punishment wrapped in grace. Vanessa threw herself into work. She stayed late, organized everything perfectly, and tried to rebuild her confidence. But every time she looked at Marcus, in meetings, during calls when he passed her desk, she saw what she had destroyed in herself years ago: belief. He was everything she once wanted to be: disciplined, patient, unstoppable. But success hadn't made him arrogant. It had made him calm, grounded, wise. The same boy who once shook while giving a presentation now spoke to million-dollar investors like he owned the world, because in a way he did. And though Vanessa tried to forget their past, it lingered like smoke in the corners of her mind. She could never unhear her own laughter. Marcus, meanwhile, noticed more than he let on. He had built his empire on focus, not emotion. But every so often, when he saw her working quietly, he'd remember the young woman in that classroom, confident, sharp, untouchable. He realized how different she seemed now, not broken, but softened. Life had changed her, too. There were times when he almost wanted to speak, to tell her he had forgiven her years ago, that her laughter had been his fire. But something stopped him. Perhaps he wasn't ready to share that truth, or perhaps he wanted her to find her own redemption first. One evening, the office was nearly empty. The city outside glowed with evening lights, cars moving like fireflies beneath the high-rise windows. Vanessa sat at her desk, finishing a report, unaware that Marcus was standing nearby watching her. He saw the exhaustion on her face, the quiet determination in her eyes. It reminded him of himself once, hungry for a second chance, desperate to be seen, not for past mistakes, but for what he could become. That night, Marcus made a decision, not out of pity, but purpose. He began assigning her small leadership roles, projects that tested her ability, decisions that mattered. He gave her room to rise the same way no one had given him a chance years ago. At first, Vanessa didn't understand why. She assumed he was testing her, waiting for her to fail. But as weeks passed, she realized something deeper. Marcus wasn't holding her past against her. He was teaching her what redemption looked like. For the first time in years, she started to believe in herself again. But inside Marcus, old emotions still stirred. Late at night, when the office was quiet and the city slept, he would think back to his journey, the nights of hunger, the loneliness, the sting of that laughter. He wondered if forgiveness was truly complete, or if part of him still wanted her to feel what he had felt. He wasn't sure, because success heals wounds, but scars remain. And sometimes, forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a process that takes time, humility, and understanding. As the months passed, their silent story continued. The once proud woman rebuilding under the guidance of the man she underestimated. They rarely spoke beyond work, but something unspoken grew between them. Not love, not friendship, but recognition. They were both survivors of their own mistakes. Vanessa began to see Marcus not as the boy she once mocked, but as a mirror of what belief can do when the world says no. She watched how he treated his team, how he helped young entrepreneurs, how he never flaunted his success. She saw that his heart had grown bigger than his ego, and with every passing day, guilt melted into gratitude. One Friday evening, as the staff celebrated another successful quarter, Vanessa stood at the back of the room, watching Marcus address the team. His words were filled with wisdom, humility, and hope. He spoke of resilience, of the beauty of failure, of never letting anyone's doubt define you. She realized then, those words weren't just for his employees. They were for her too. The applause that followed thundered through the hall. Marcus met her eyes briefly, and for the first time she didn't look away. She nodded, and not in apology, but in silent understanding. She knew now that redemption wasn't something you ask for. It's something you earn, through change, through action, through becoming better than who you were. That night, as Marcus left the office, he paused by her desk. She thanked him for the opportunity, not in words, but through the quiet steadiness in her gaze. He nodded once more, then walked away. And though nothing was said aloud, both of them knew their story wasn't finished. Before Marcus ever became the man who owned skyscrapers and commanded boardrooms, he was a man who faced darkness alone. And that darkness, that fire, was what built him. Success never came to Marcus easily. Behind every polished suit and every quiet smile was a decade of pain, rejection, and endurance. People saw the billionaire. They didn't see the battles he fought to become one. Long before BrightPath Technologies became a global name, Marcus lived in the back of a rusted van on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, just a mattress, a cracked phone, and dreams that felt too big for the space he had. Some nights, the cold bit through the metal walls. Other nights, hunger gnawed at him until he could barely think. But the fire never went out. Every morning, before dawn, he would walk to a small cafe with free Wi-Fi, carrying his old laptop, the same one he'd used in college. He would order the cheapest coffee just to earn a seat, then spend hours coding, writing proposals, sending emails to investors who never replied. When he wasn't online, he was out meeting small business owners, talking to farmers, listening to stories of struggle and survival. He didn't have money to give them, but he gave them something rarer, attention. He understood their pain because it was his, too. The more he listened, the clearer his mission became. He would build something that connected the overlooked to the opportunities they deserved. But dreams come with enemies. Some people mocked him. Old classmates called him the dropout chasing. Ghosts, even his closest. Friend once told him to give up before the world crushed him. But Marcus had already been crushed, and he had learned how to rise. Every rejection made him sharper. Every failure made him hungrier. When his first app crashed after launch, he didn't quit. He studied what went wrong, rebuilt it from the ground up, and launched again. The second failed too. The third brought debt and sleepless nights. But the fourth changed everything. That app, simple, functional, and powerful, connected small African farmers directly to restaurants and export buyers. It eliminated the middlemen who had taken most of their profits for decades. It gave power back to the people who worked the hardest and earned the least. At first, it spread quietly, village to village. Then word traveled fast. Within months, hundreds of farmers were using it. Then thousands. Investors started calling. One major deal turned into 2, then 5. And suddenly, the man who once couldn't afford a meal had to decide which. $1 million contract, but through it all, Marcus never forgot where he came from. He kept the van, never sold it, never cleaned it out. It was a reminder, a monument to struggle. When the first article about his success appeared online, he didn't smile. He just stared at the headline, "College Dropout Builds Empire from Nothing." He remembered that laughter in the classroom. He remembered Vanessa's smirk, the professor's silence, the weight of shame pressing down on his chest. Those memories were still there, buried beneath the victories. But now they burned differently. They weren't wounds anymore, they were fuel. Marcus learned something that few ever do. Revenge can be a spark, but purpose is the fire that lasts. Years passed and the empire grew. Offices opened across continents. Young entrepreneurs looked up to him, investors respected him, and magazines named him one of the most influential black CEOs in the world. And yet, when he stood on the balcony of his penthouse one night, staring out over the glittering city, he felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. He had won. But the victory felt incomplete, because deep inside, he knew the story wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about finding peace with the part of himself that once felt unworthy. That was the part Vanessa had touched, not through cruelty, but through that single moment of disbelief that changed his life. She had laughed, yes, but it was his reaction to that laughter that shaped him. So when fate brought her back into his life, Marcus didn't see it as coincidence. He saw it as closure waiting to happen. In the weeks that followed, he often found himself watching her quietly during meetings, not with anger, but curiosity. She had changed. The confidence she once wore like armor was now tempered by humility. The woman who once mocked a dreamer now served that dream's reality. And somehow, that balance brought Marcus a strange comfort. He began reflecting more deeply on his past, on pain, on power. He realized that success wasn't measured by how high you rise, but by how you carry those who once stumbled with you. That's why he started something new, a mentorship program within BrightPath, offering training and support for underprivileged young people who reminded him of himself. He funded scholarships, opened coding centers, and hired those whom society had written off. The fire that once burned with anger had transformed into something else entirely: light. And yet, even as Marcus gave back, he still struggled with one question. Could he ever truly forgive Vanessa? Not just in words, but in heart? He wanted to believe so. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that classroom, that board, that laughter. The sound didn't haunt him anymore, but it still echoed, faintly, like thunder after a storm. One day, while sorting through old boxes at home, Marcus found something buried under papers and awards. It was a torn notebook, the same one he'd used in college. On the last page was the sentence he had written the night he dropped out. "They laughed today, but I'll build something they'll never forget." He smiled, and not bitterly, but softly, because he had built it, and now she was part of it. That night, he closed his laptop early and drove out of the city. He parked near the same cafe where it all began, walked to the exact spot he used to sit, and ordered a coffee, the same $1 cup that had fueled years of dreaming. He looked around. The place hadn't changed much, but he had. He realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering differently, seeing pain not as the reason to hate, but as the reason you grew. Marcus took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, he felt light. Because when fire stops burning, it starts illuminating. Some falls happen fast. A single mistake, a single moment, and everything shatters. Others happen slowly, piece by piece, until one day you wake up and realize the life you built has quietly crumbled beneath you. For Vanessa, it was both. Years before she walked into Marcus's office as his new assistant, she had been living the dream, or at least the illusion of one. After graduation, she landed a job at one of the city's top marketing firms. She had the right clothes, the right friends, the right apartment with the perfect skyline view. Every Friday night meant cocktails and laughter. Every Monday morning meant another meeting filled with ambition and arrogance. She moved fast, climbed faster, and looked down on anyone who moved slower. The laughter that once humiliated Marcus had become her weapon in life. She used it often, to hide insecurity, to dismiss weakness, to mask the emptiness forming inside her. But life has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. When her firm got caught in a financial scandal, the downfall was swift. Promises vanished overnight, paychecks bounced, and reputations shattered. The same people who had once called her brilliant now refused to return her calls. The man she was engaged to quietly walked out of her life, leaving nothing but a note and unpaid bills. Her savings disappeared trying to survive the chaos. She moved from her luxury apartment to a smaller one, then smaller still, until she found herself in a cramped room in a forgotten part of the city, a place that smelled of damp walls and lost hope. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. At first, Vanessa tried to fight it. She sent out job applications, dressed up for interviews, forced a smile that no longer reached her eyes. But the city that once celebrated her now ignored her. She was yesterday's story, another casualty of the corporate storm. It was during one of those long, hopeless nights that she thought about Marcus. Not with pride, but regret. She remembered that moment in college, his trembling voice, his fragile hope, her laughter cutting through the air like glass. She had told herself it was harmless teasing, but now, sitting in the dark, she understood what cruelty really was, because she had become what she once made fun of, a person struggling, unseen, uncertain. So when she finally saw the job listing for Bright Path Technologies, she applied without even thinking. She didn't recognize the name, didn't connect it to the boy from her past. She just saw a chance, a lifeline. She told herself that if she ever got the job, she would be different. She would work with humility, respect, and gratitude. She had no idea that fate was about to give her a far greater lesson. When she walked into that office for the first time and saw Marcus, everything inside her froze. The years fell away, and she saw not the billionaire CEO, but the young man she had once mocked for daring to dream. The shock was unbearable. The guilt, worse. Every time she looked at him in those early weeks, she saw her own failure reflected back. Not because Marcus punished her, he never did, but because his success illuminated everything she could have been if she had chosen faith over arrogance. Vanessa tried to hide her shame behind professionalism. She was polite, efficient, invisible. But Marcus noticed. He saw the way her eyes dropped when he entered the room, the way her hands trembled when she handed him documents. He could have used that power. He could have made her relive every humiliation she had caused him. But he didn't, because Marcus had grown in ways Vanessa couldn't yet understand. He had learned that real strength doesn't humiliate, it heals. And grace, when shown to those who don't deserve it, is the highest form of power. As the months passed, Vanessa began to rediscover herself through that grace. The more kindness Marcus showed, the more she worked to earn it. She stayed late to perfect her reports, volunteered for difficult tasks, and spoke to others with empathy she had never known before. Her colleagues started to admire her dedication. They saw a woman who didn't just work for a paycheck, but for purpose. What they didn't know was that every ounce of her effort came from a need to atone. Not to Marcus, but to the version of herself she had betrayed years ago. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by the office window after everyone had left, staring out at the city lights and remembering the laughter she had once used as armor. She realized now that it hadn't been confidence, it had been fear. Fear of failing, fear of being seen as small. But the irony was cruel. In trying so hard to look powerful, she had become weak. Marcus, on the other hand, continued to rise. His company expanded into new continents. His name appeared on magazine covers, and his voice began inspiring millions of young people who once thought dreams were only for the privileged. But deep down, Marcus knew he was still learning too. He had built wealth, but forgiveness, that was still a work in progress. One afternoon, he found Vanessa crying quietly in the break room. She didn't see him enter. He stood there for a moment, watching her shoulders shake. He didn't say a word. He just turned and left. But something changed in him that day. He realized that her punishment had already been written by life itself. He didn't need to add to it. The next morning, he sent her a message. "I see your effort. Keep going." It was short, simple. But to Vanessa, it felt like the first real mercy she had ever been given. From that day, she worked not from guilt, but from gratitude. And Marcus began to notice something remarkable. The more she grew, the more peace he found. It was as if helping her heal was healing him too. Life had come full circle. The boy who was mocked now mentoring the woman who once mocked him. But this time there was no pride, no pain, only quiet grace. Vanessa started smiling again, not out of arrogance, but humility. She began mentoring new hires, helping them avoid the mistakes she had made. Slowly, she was becoming the person Marcus had always believed he could be. Someone who lifts others up, even after being pushed down. And one day, when she looked at him across the conference table, she didn't see the boy she once pitied. She saw the man she now respected. Because time had reversed their roles and taught them both that the greatest power in this world isn't success, it's mercy. The past has a voice. Sometimes it whispers through memories. Other times, it walks straight into your life, uninvited and undeniable. For Marcus and Vanessa, that day had come. It was a Monday morning, the kind that begins with endless meetings and the smell of fresh ambition. BrightPath Technologies was hosting a major partnership event. Investors, media, and dignitaries filled the lobby. The air buzzed with opportunity. Marcus was the center of it all, calm, confident, composed. But across the room, Vanessa felt her heart beating faster than usual. She had been tasked with managing event logistics, and though she'd handled hundreds before, today felt different. Something in the air felt heavy, like the universe was preparing her for a reckoning. And then she saw them. A small group of business school representatives arrived, partners from the same university where she and Marcus had once studied. They were here to announce a scholarship collaboration. The university wanted to honor Marcus, the dropout who had become a billionaire by creating a Dreamers Fund in his name. The crowd applauded when the announcement was made, but Vanessa stood still, frozen in place. The words business school and dreamers fund were enough to drag her back into that classroom 10 years ago. The memory hit her hard, the laughter, the whispers, the shame she had caused. It played in her mind as vividly as if it were happening all over again. When Marcus took the stage to speak, Vanessa's chest tightened. He spoke with passion, humility, and strength about failure, perseverance, and how belief in oneself can change everything. His voice carried the same conviction it once did in that classroom, but now it was laced with power, experience, and grace. He didn't mention names. He didn't recall the laughter. But everyone in that audience could feel the history in his tone. Even those who didn't know his story could sense that he had lived every word he spoke. As he ended his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward. But Marcus's eyes found Vanessa's through the crowd. Calm, unreadable, knowing. She looked away, overwhelmed. The applause around her sounded like thunder, but inside, she felt silence. She knew she had to say something, not for him, but for herself. That evening, long after the event ended, Vanessa stayed behind, tidying up the empty conference hall. The banners were down, the lights dimmed, and the echoes of clapping had faded into quiet. She stood there alone, staring at the podium where Marcus had spoken. It was more than a stage. It was the place where her past and present collided. She didn't hear him enter. Marcus stood by the doorway, watching her quietly, hands in his pockets. The silence between them stretched, filled with years of unspoken words. For the first time since she had joined his company, Vanessa turned to face him fully. Her eyes glistened, not with pride or embarrassment, but honesty. She didn't need to speak aloud for him to understand. Her face said everything her voice could not. I was wrong. Marcus walked closer, stopping a few feet away. He studied her expression, the weight of guilt, the courage it took to stand there. He could have made her say it. He could have demanded an apology. but he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded. Because forgiveness had already happened, not in words but in time. Vanessa felt tears slide down her cheeks, not from sadness but relief. The years of regret she carried began to melt away under that single gesture. She realized that forgiveness doesn't always come in speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it's silent, a nod, a look, an understanding. That night, Marcus went home and sat on his balcony, watching the city lights flicker below. He thought about the boy he once was, hungry, scared, humiliated, and the man he had become. He thought about how the universe had a strange rhythm, one that brings people back to the lessons they never finished learning. For him, that lesson had been about power. He had learned that true power wasn't control, wealth, or revenge. It was restraint. It was rising above what once dragged you down. Vanessa, meanwhile, sat on the bus ride home in silence. For the first time in years, she didn't feel weighed down by her past. She had faced it, looked it in the eyes, and survived. She thought about how life had flipped their roles. Marcus had once been the broken one, mocked by her laughter. Now she was the one humbled by his grace. But in that reversal, something beautiful had happened. They had both found freedom. In the following weeks, things began to shift between them. Not in obvious ways. There were no long talks, no confessions. But there was mutual respect, quiet understanding, and a strange sense of partnership. Marcus began including her in higher-level meetings. He asked for her opinions, trusted her instincts. And Vanessa, in turn, gave her best, not out of guilt, but gratitude. The team noticed the change. They saw how seamlessly the two worked together, how Marcus listened when she spoke, how she anticipated his needs before he said a word. But no one knew the story. Beneath that connection, the history, that made every interaction carry unspoken depth. Then, one afternoon, an email came in from the university. They wanted both Marcus and Vanessa to return to campus for an alumni event, to speak to students about success and humility. When she saw the invitation, Vanessa froze. The thought of returning to that building, that same lecture hall where it all began, felt impossible. But Marcus said yes, and somehow she knew she had to go too. She didn't realize it yet. But that trip would become the moment their story truly came full circle. Because sometimes the past doesn't just speak, it demands to be heard. The sky over the old university shimmered with the golden hue of late afternoon sunlight. 10 years had passed since Marcus had last walked through those gates. 10 years since he'd been the dreamer no one believed in. Now the world looked different. The campus lawns were perfectly trimmed. The new business building gleamed with glass and pride, and a banner stretched across the entrance. Alumni Spotlight Marcus Cole, founder and CEO of Brightpath Technologies. Marcus stepped out of his car, a black luxury sedan that reflected the sunlight like a mirror. Yet even with the weight of his success behind him, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. The memories here were not of glory. They were of laughter, humiliation, and the sound of a promise that once seemed foolish. Vanessa followed behind, her posture straight, but her heart trembling. She hadn't been back since graduation. Every corner of this campus carried ghosts. The old friends who had drifted away, the dreams she once thought were hers alone. As they walked toward the main hall, students whispered. Some recognized Marcus immediately, the billionaire dropout who had built an empire from nothing. He smiled politely, but his mind was far away, pulled back to the day everything changed. Inside, the hall was packed. Professors, students, and alumni filled the rows. The same professor who had once called Marcus a good kid with unrealistic dreams now stood at the podium beaming with pride. When Marcus's name was announced, the audience erupted in applause. Cameras clicked, lights flashed, and the once dismissed dreamer took the stage. He paused before speaking, letting the moment breathe. The stage lights washed over him, and for a heartbeat, he saw not the crowd, but the ghost of his younger self. The boy with cheap shoes, sitting in the last row, holding on to faith while everyone else laughed. He began to speak. Marcus talked about struggle, rejection, and the illusion of failure. He spoke about sleeping on couches, working long nights, losing friends, and building from nothing. He told them that life wasn't about luck or talent. It was about endurance. The hall was silent, hanging on to every word. And then he said something no one expected. He told them about a day when he had stood in this very building, full of hope, and was laughed at, not out of cruelty but disbelief. He said that sometimes the world will laugh when it doesn't understand your vision, and that laughter should never stop you. It should fuel you. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Vanessa sat near the front row, her hands trembling. She remembered everything, every cruel word, every careless giggle. But as she watched him stand there, strong and unshaken, she didn't see the boy she had mocked. She saw the man who had become everything he promised he would be. When the applause rose again, Marcus smiled faintly and stepped back. The speech was over, but the story wasn't. After the event, people swarmed him, reporters, students, investors. Yet through the noise, he saw Vanessa standing by the door, quietly waiting. When their eyes met, she didn't smile. She simply nodded, the way someone does when they finally accept the truth. Later, as the campus emptied and the lights dimmed, Marcus and Vanessa walked together through the old courtyard. The same courtyard where it had all begun. The stone benches were still there, the same oak trees still swaying in the wind. The world had changed, but this place hadn't. Marcus stopped by the fountain, the one that had once been his favorite spot to sit and dream. The sound of water felt like the heartbeat of time, steady, constant, forgiving. He thought about all the pain, all the doubt, and how it had shaped him. Then he turned to Vanessa, and for the first time since she'd joined his company, he spoke her name. It wasn't a question or a reproach, just her name, spoken softly, as if acknowledging that she had always been part of the journey, even in the hardest way. She met his gaze with tears that glimmered in the fading sunlight. In that silence, she finally let go of the pride she had carried all her life. She had spent years chasing validation, from peers, from success, from herself. But none of it had filled the emptiness of regret, until now. Because forgiveness, she realized, was the only thing that could heal what shame had broken. Marcus smiled, faint but genuine. He wasn't angry anymore. He hadn't been for years. The boy she had laughed at was gone, and in his place stood a man who had learned that revenge may feel powerful, but compassion lasts longer. They stood there for a long time, two people tied by a single story, now finally free of it. When they returned to the car, Vanessa looked back one last time at the campus. The wind caught her hair, and she thought about how strange life was, how it circles back to teach us the lessons we once ignored. In that moment, she didn't feel like his secretary, or his former classmate, or even the girl who had once laughed at his dream. She felt human again, flawed, forgiven, and finally at peace. As they drove away, the setting sun painted the sky in colors of gold and crimson. Marcus looked out the window, watching the horizon stretch endlessly ahead. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, the laughter, the struggle, the lonely nights when no one believed in him. He realized that every painful moment had been worth it, not because of where it led, but because of who it made him become. He whispered to himself quietly so no one else could hear, "You were right to believe, even when no one did." The car moved on, disappearing into the orange glow of evening, and somewhere, deep in the echo of time, the laughter that once haunted him finally faded, replaced by the sound of peace.